All
Perfect.
right, there we go. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
So before we jump into this, I just want to get back to the conversation that we were having. So I guess everybody else can benefit from it too. So we were talking about a certain discomfort that you're having right now with your back, inflammation, possible sciatica, and clamshells that have been scripted into all of our workouts, all of our booty focused workouts. And I was saying, and you agreed, that just because a specific exercise is on your program doesn't mean that you can't sub it out with something that works on the same movement pattern. And so I was saying, if it hurts, don't do it. And you're like, yeah, absolutely. So I was going to, I mean, this is not a sponsored thing. This is not, well, no, it's not sponsored, but I'm not promoting any specific program. But I was actually using, Lane Norton had a program builder. I'm sure it's still available. It was fantastic because what would happen is he would like in within the program there would be a drop down menu, and so let's say for instance you chose a squat, you could actually drop down and it would give you a whole bunch of alternative movements that were essentially activating the exact same muscle groups, and that way you could find things that one were comfortable for your body and that worked with your physiology. Some people have like longer femurs, shorter femurs, whatever the case may be, and that also would be activating the exact same muscles in a way that you could actually feel them. Because I know there's certain exercises that I perform, honestly, even like a hip thrust loaded in certain ways, I don't actually feel it in my glutes at all. Loaded in other ways, I do. So just to say that just because it's on your program, and I'm not telling you to be defiant and not, follow your plan or listen to your coach, just because a specific exercise is on your plan doesn't mean that other exercises can't be subbed in that are better suited to you. So have those conversations with your coaches for sure and be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself about like how your body's actually feeling during the workout, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, you want your workouts to be as effective as possible, and you really don't want to be in pain. And if you're in pain, your workouts are not going to be effective. You're probably just going to have to stop early. And I mean, I went through that with the exact same experience where I had clamshells and some other booty things on my plan. And then it was honestly just giving me pain. And so it's so important to just communicate that to your coach if you need things changed out. And it's like you said, we all have different physiology. And personally, for me, my femurs are so long
Yeah.
that some things honestly just don't work for me the way that they would for other people. So, yeah, it's just so important to make sure you're communicating that to your coach because at the end of the day, we all just want that vitality and that longevity with our workouts.
That's exactly it. And what a perfect segue, because we're going to be talking about more specificity, more biospecificity that you can actually pour into your programs based on the data that you're going to get from one of our beloved functional labs. And today we're talking about the SHP by Fluids IQ. SHP is the stress and hormone panel. We're going to be looking at lots of different markers. Last time we spoke here, we were talking about the GI map, and we said that there was literally no client that gets away without running that stool sample, the GI map, because it says so much about everything that's going on in the body from head to toe. The SHP does the exact same thing. So I would say personally, when clients are coming to me, the two biggest systems or biggest concerns that they have is gut and hormones. Would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Every single client I work with, the first things we look at is GI map and the stress and hormones panel.
Exactly, exactly. And the one marker that really ties both of them together that is on the stress and hormone panel is cortisol. Now, the stress and hormone panel is a salivary test. So essentially, you're going to be spitting into a little vial, and that is different than looking at something like cortisol on a on your with blood serum. So whether that be conventional or functional, it really is different because it allows us to look at cortisol as a diurnal pattern, as a rhythm, as a cascade over the course of a 24-hour period, beginning at the onset of the day all the way until night before you go to sleep. And while there are ranges and allowances across all of the different markers that we look at in conventional and functional lab work, when it comes to cortisol, the pattern itself is strict. So we want a certain amount, a total volume of cortisol output, and that's our stress hormone. So that is what allows us to respond appropriately to all the different stressors, physical, mental, emotional, perceived, biochemical. but we also want it to follow a very specific pattern. So a little bit more rigidity there. And it's one of the markers, I would say it's the marker, it is the keystone marker that tells us really how the body is dealing with life. So why don't we jump into what all of these markers are, what they tell us, how we use them, and why they are relevant to our female athletes. Do you have a favorite marker on the
Yeah.
SHBG that you want to talk about?
Honestly, I'm gonna say that cortisol is my favorite marker on the SHP. And to be honest, I think cortisol is kind of one of those like trendy words right now where people are throwing out a lot, but they're not really sure exactly what this means. And so when we get into cortisol, it's the most talked about stress hormone.
Yep.
And so yes, cortisol is very necessary for your body's natural stress response. It's produced by your adrenal glands, and basically its job is to help you handle short bursts of stress. And so whether that's going to be a physical workout or maybe a mental challenge, it's going to trigger that release of glucose to give you energy. And so the thing with cortisol is when it is chronically elevated, because it's not meant to be chronically elevated, it's only meant to be short bursts. When it's chronically elevated, it's going to give you a lot of issues. And when I say issues, I mean sleep disturbances, muscle breakdown, hormonal imbalances, energy depletion, impaired fat loss, and just so many other things. And so it's so good to see where cortisol is at because we really need to know if it's high or if it's low, because that can determine everything in regards to your treatment plan, the way that you need to approach cortisol, and all of that. And that being said, too, cortisol is a catabolic hormone. And so when I say that, I mean that if it is elevated, it is going to start breaking down certain things, such as hormones, such as muscle tissue, immune system, things like that. And so it is, again, just so important to make sure that that cortisol is in check because it does have that catabolic effect.
And let's remember from previous discussions that our primary focus when it comes to cortisol is really survival, right? So cortisol is secreting to take us away from trouble, to help us better deal with trouble or perceive trouble. Reproductive prowess, libido, those are not things that are going to be prioritized over survival. And so when cortisol is dysregulated, and we'll talk about what that actually means with respect to your cortisol curve or your patterning, um, or just chronically elevated, it is going to actually borrow resource and reserve from reproductive function, from libido. So we're talking about things like testosterone, like your various estrogens, and like progesterone. And so when our cortisol is chronically elevated, and for instance, with an athlete, you know, is totally divorced from gut issues, just the stress of low calories, of high levels of exertion, lots of workouts, tons of cardio. What happens is production of things like testosterone and progesterone are downregulated, which leaves us susceptible to having either estrogen dominance or estrogen dominant like symptoms relative to progesterone, which is going to impact things like your sleep and your recovery, your strength in the gym, your mood, all of it. So it really is something that as athletes, we should be hyper concerned about. And not to say that we want to bring our cortisol down completely, because as Angelica stated, it's a really important hormone. We need to have an adaptive capacity. We need to be able to adapt to all the different stressors of life and of our program, but we just want to make sure that it is responding appropriately. And so what that curve looks like, what is an appropriate cortisol response? We want it to peak in the morning. It has an awakening effect. It is what, gets us up and out of bed and ready to go after our day. And then we want it to start to taper down towards midday. That would be the biggest drop, and then slowly towards the end of day. When we see total cortisol output that is appropriate, but um, more of this, more of like a roller coaster ride, where maybe you're actually waking up with lower levels of cortisol and maybe it's peaking sort of mid to late afternoon or even before bed so that you're not able to fall asleep or stay asleep. That is something that could be pointing to an unwanted stressor. So too much stress perhaps an infection, that's where we start to look at things like the GI map, liver congestion, and the sort. So your cortisol pattern, those are just two things I want you guys to remember, is that it's not just about total cortisol output, but also the patterning. It has to actually ride that very, very slow downturn from its peak at the onset of the day down to evening before bed.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I actually really love about the SHP is it actually gives you that little graph of what your cortisol is doing throughout the day. And I find that such a useful tool. And on that graph, it also shows you relative to where your cortisol levels should be. And so honestly, like almost always, we do see that up and down throughout the day, and that's really not what we want. And that can give us so much insight to exactly what's going on. Um, the other thing that I always look at in regards to cortisol is another hormone that's called DHEA. And so I said that your cortisol is catabolic. When we think of DHEA, it's anabolic. And so we really want these two hormones to be in balance because we don't want too much of either one. We really want these to be in balance. And so low DHEA, well, basically what DHEA is, it's a precursor to both testosterone and estrogen, and it plays a huge role in helping your body manage stress. And like I said, it counterbalances cortisol by keeping your stress levels in check. And so if your body is under chronic stress, then your DHEA can start to drop, and this is where things can become problematic. And so then if your DHEA is low, it suggests that your body's coping mechanisms are wearing out. And so that's going to contribute to fatigue, low libido, weakened immune system. A huge one is reduced muscle mass, even reduced digestion. So when you think about your anabolic hormone becoming lower and almost depleted in a sense, you think about all the things that this hormone is going to be bringing up in your body. So if it's low, then all of these good functions that we want in our body are actually going to become low as well.
And so throughout this panel, and honestly, in pretty much all of our labs, we're always looking at things in ratio. So one marker relative to another. And just to really underscore the point that there is no system that exists in the absence of another. There is no marker that really exists in the absence of another. Everything is interconnected. So it's why, if you come across our our sort of profile of clients, you will rarely work on just one symptom or look at just one lab, because how the entire system is responding and working functionally together as a whole is really important to us. Another two markers that we like to look at in relationship to one another that we can see on the SHP would be estradiol, which is one of our three estrogens, in and of itself, and in its relation to progesterone. And so progesterone, we've spoken about this before, is sort of like, I would say, the big sister to estrogen. Estrogen can get really out of hand when her big sister isn't there as her accountability partner. Progesterone is that Goldilocks hormone where it just makes everything feel just right. So lowered progesterone as a result of dysregulated cortisol, or even as a result of something like entering our perimenopause years. I know a lot of our athletes, with master's divisions, are definitely in that phase, that hormonal stage of life. That lowered progesterone, unfortunately, it can drive up estrogen or allow it to get really dysregulated. And that's where we begin to see a lot of the mental health symptoms that we can see in our athletes. So the anxiety and the irritability, the mood dysregulation, where we really start to notice the lowering of progesterone, whether it's a result of perimenopause or the high stress levels and cortisol output of prep, is actually in that second half of our menstrual cycle. So if you are noticing that the first 2 weeks of your menstrual cycle, you're actually feeling pretty good, your outlook is good, your mindset is good, and then as you move into the last 2 weeks, it takes a real turn and you're finding yourself a little bit shorter, your mood is just not good, you're starting to hyperfixate maybe on other athletes and what they're doing, and you're not really able to manage your your anxiety that's coming up, your feelings of, inadequacy, if there is a stark difference between those last 2 weeks of your cycle and the top 2 weeks, there might be a progesterone problem. And so lots of different options, other than, of course, managing your stress, but there are actually natural supplements that can help give progesterone what it needs to actually regulate itself, bring it back up, and keep estrogen in check. So those two, like I said, individually are really phenomenal markers for us to see and understand and track over the course of our prep, but also how they relate to each other is really, really crucial.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I mean, I honestly have a very personal experience with my cortisol and estrogen and progesterone, because during my prep, my cortisol was so high, and then it really suppressed my progesterone. And so in the end, I was left with estrogen dominance. And so what that gave me, it gave me symptoms like acne. I had severe bloating. I had severe PMS symptoms. My period was just a disaster, and I would be in bed for 2 days with, taking a bunch of Advil because it was just so painful. And so I really only learned that by running one of these labs. And so I'm so grateful that I did. And like I said, I learned that my cortisol was so high, it was suppressing my progesterone, and my estrogen was just taking over. And so I ended up taking some supplements. I also actually ended up supplementing with a progesterone cream, which made such a big difference because my progesterone was on the floor. And so I'm so thrilled now to say that I'm feeling so much better and that I ran this lab and I figured out exactly what was going on, because if I didn't, it would have just been that cycle of trial and error and trying to figure out what's going on. And sometimes in the end, when you do that, you can honestly just make things worse.
Absolutely. And so what you were experiencing was a stress-driven hormonal imbalance. And what we can also see, so there's a different version of the SHP that we can take a look at that has insulin on it as well. But we can actually see a stress-driven insulin resistance, which of course has everything to do with our liver health, liver congestion, which can, of course, we spoke about this last week too with beta glucuronidase, can drive estrogen levels back up by recirculating otherwise bound estrogen back into the system. So, we're looking at something that is supposedly only about our stress hormones, our sex hormones, but really we're again talking about digestion. We're talking about gut permeability because unfortunately, as those two particular hormones begin to decline, progesterone and estrogen, we do deal with a lot more permeability in the gut. So not digesting things well, a lot of distension, gas, bloating, and recirculating of metabolites that need to leave the system back into Gen Pop. So really a pretty remarkable lab to run. So insightful. I like this one in particular, though, because it is a salivary sample. And I will say this, that as soon as you introduce, you know, something like blood, a lot of people get really nervous. And when you're testing cortisol, which is a stress response hormone, we want to be able to manage or mitigate, any additional stress so not to skew the results. Some people are really weary of getting poked, and I totally get that. And so I would say that I'd like to argue that a salivary test that you can take in the comfort of your own home is going to trigger less stress than perhaps going to a phlebotomist and getting a blood draw. And so you're more likely to get an accurate result. The other thing that I really like about salivary tests in particular, when it comes to our hormones, is that you're actually getting the fractioned hormone, so the usable hormone. The hormones are actually acting upon your system versus just total hormone load. And that's important because it's not about, kind of like, with what we eat, it's not about what you eat, it's what you absorb. And so with hormones, it's not just about what you produce, but actually what you utilize. And that's one thing that saliva sampling can definitely offer us. Where it does have certain drawbacks, I would say would be sort of user error. So things like, vigorously brushing your teeth, eating certain things immediately before testing. But so long as you get clear on how to take the test effectively, which obviously we support all of our clients with, you shouldn't have an issue at all. So all in all, I would say that salivary testing is really fantastic. Now, the other test that a lot of people do tend to run, and that a lot of people are maybe more familiar with when it comes to hormone testing, is the Dutch Nothing wrong with the Dutch. Phenomenal test. Definitely does give you more information, specifically with respect to conversion to clearance. So how our bodies by certain clearance pathways. That's a test that we would use on a client who maybe is considering, you know, bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. That would definitely be something that we would want to look at before we actually would introduce a protocol or solution. So the SHP definitely has its place. And I would honestly say that there are times when too much info can, again, be really stressful. And so I, want to just make sure that people understand that there is definitely a place for the Dutch. You're not going to, go down the wrong path if you're running the Dutch. I just don't know that it's always necessary. And especially at the price point that the SHP comes in at, it is so much more accessible to our clients. And, we both are really mindful of that, especially when you think about like just the overall cost of prep and want to ensure that we're offering them options, screening options and package options that are actually affordable so that they don't bypass this phase of their overall prep and recovery.
Yeah, no, it's such a valuable test, and the Dutch too is also amazing. The one thing that I also love about the doing a salivary test is that it's not only going to give you a snapshot like blood work would. And so when we look at the SHP, we see that we're given four different cortisol. So basically, it is measured in the morning, noon, afternoon, and evening. And so when we do blood work, however, that's only going to give you a snapshot of what your cortisol look like. So if you just hit a hard workout or you had an argument with somebody or you just had a stressful few moments and you're getting your blood work taken and your blood work comes back as your cortisol is really high, that is not the full picture. And so you're going to get that result and say, oh, okay, so I need to be treating for high cortisol, where that actually really might not be the case. And so, again, I just love the SHP for that reason, where we can see what your cortisol is doing throughout the day. And then that's going to give us an actual answer as to what your hormones are doing, your cortisol is doing, and whether it's actually high or low.
Yeah, to your point, I had a client recently come across my space who her cortisol awakening response, so that CAR was actually appropriate. So she was excuse me, I am like losing my footing today. So she was waking up in the morning with an appropriate cortisol response, and that was actually when she ran her blood work. Surprising because me personally, if I had to get to the lab early in the morning, especially with everything that's going on in my house, I'd probably have some pretty high cortisol. But nonetheless, she had an appropriate cortisol response first thing in the morning. And what her interpreting physician told her was that means that everything looks good, everything is fine. When in fact, she was actually highly symptomatic, and her symptoms did suggest that there was a lot of cortisol dysregulation. When we took a look at her cortisol patterning, that diurnal rhythm, through the lens of the SHP, what we found was that yes, in fact, her morning cortisol was appropriate, but that in fact, later in the afternoon, so that reading before noon or between rather noon and bedtime, she was having a significant jump in her cortisol. What we later discovered was that it was actually something that she was eating. She was consuming a food very regularly in advance of that time of day. That wasn't something that she would have considered an allergen, so she wasn't getting an obvious allergic response, but it was actually a sensitivity. It was causing quite a bit of inflammation and, throwing that histamine up, which is obviously going to drive cortisol up. And so, again, something that needs to be addressed and definitely gives us a clue into whether or not she is eating properly. Maybe you guys are having that sort of afternoon sugar and coffee combo that is driving cortisol up, leaving you with a significant crash in the evening. Those are all things that we want to take a look at. And so, yes, just like Angelica said, that snapshot at that you might have on blood work, just looking at cortisol at one point in the day is telling you something, but it's not telling you everything. And it's absolutely not telling us enough. But there are some other markers on this SHP that are not necessarily stress and hormone in the way that we conventionally think about stress and hormone. So, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, cortisol, DHEA, but they actually do take a look at overall systemic inflammation and the gut. So we have two, got secretory IgA, and that is a morning marker. And we also have melatonin. Now, generally, when we speak about melatonin, we think sleep. This is melatonin at high noon divorced from sleep. Melatonin has numerous functions in the body. Obviously, it helps us get to sleep, stay asleep, and it is extremely important when it comes to our brain health because what it does as a function is actually help to detoxify our brain while we sleep. That's why we want you guys to get to bed on time. Stop doom scrolling, put the phones away. But melatonin divorced from sleep actually speaks to potentially infection and inflammation in the body, as does secretory IgA. Now, Angelica, I think you had mentioned this last week when we were talking about SIG-A on the GI map that you do tend to prefer to see it higher rather than flatlined because higher speaks to an acute infection, so something that maybe hasn't really proliferated systemically that we can still get a handle on, rather than has been fighting for a really long time to get things managed and has actually just plummeted because it can't anymore. And so that's something that even in the absence of a GI map, we're able to see through the stress and hormone panel. Now, why would these exist on a stress and hormone panel? Well, because infection and inflammation definitely does drive up cortisol. And so when we see, for instance, an exhaustive level of cortisol, meaning that it's completely flatlined, or DHEA is exhausted and no longer able to secrete to actually keep cortisol under control. And we then see that there is this flatline secretory IgA, meaning that you've been dealing with some sort of obstacle, infection for a really long period of time. We know exactly where we need to work. So it's really about taking all of these different pieces of the puzzle, correlating them back to the symptoms that you show up with, that you're having discomfort around, and trying to figure out where we can actually move the needle forward, where we need to, apply pressure, where we need to pull back so that we can get you back to feeling amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that leads us back to, I believe, I want to say we talked about this last time, but that not all stress is mental stress. And I know that we all really believe that, but so much of our stress is physical. And even if it's something like a food sensitivity, like you said, that's going to be driving up bloating, gas, constipation, and that is stress to our body. And we talked about that your body cannot differentiate what is mental stress and what is physical stress. And so
Yeah.
at the end of the day, stress is stress. And that's what we need to dive deeper in and to figure out what is causing these stressors and what we like to say is these hidden imbalances. And so when we say hidden, what we really mean by that is hormone, immune, digestion, detoxification, energy, and nervous system. And so when we look at all of those markers and we can find what is causing those hidden stressors, then we can really do a deep dive into cortisol. And so I personally, I really like looking at the melatonin marker on the SHP. And it's really interesting because I think I want to say it's something more like 400 more times of melatonin is produced in your gut than in your brain, which I think is just so crazy because when you think of melatonin, you think it's always produced in your brain and for sleep. But it's such a great marker. And so because it's produced in your gut, it's actually produced in your smooth muscle and in your lining in your digestive system. So it can have a lot to do with gut motility, digestive health, and so it's also relieved by your enteric nervous system. And so that's the nervous system of your gut. And so again, it's going to help control processes like gut motility and then protecting your gut lining from stress and inflammation. And so if you are experiencing symptoms like bloating, digestive comfort, slow digestion, this can point to a disruption in melatonin production. And it's a sign that your body's stress response is just taking a toll on your digestive system.
So all in all, I would say the SHP is a pretty appropriate test for our athletes to be looking at. It seems to answer a lot of questions around why are we not sleeping well? Why are we not recovering well? Where did my energy go? Why is my libido dipping the further, I get into prep? Why is my cycle becoming dysregulated? Why does my gut feel so disruptive? Why am I not able to digest these foods anymore? It's such a simple test to take and it provides so much data. Where I worry is, I guess, just the marketplace in general right now, as you spoke about at the onset of this podcast, is so cortisol focused. And so typically when, we see a problem, we see a solution. And the solution that I'm seeing a lot of right now, well, there's two. One is, I'm not giving any credit to this product, but everybody is talking about cortisol face and happy juice, I think it is. So some sort of product, some sort of supplement that everybody seems to be promoting right now that is supposed to bring down your cortisol levels. But as we discussed, dysregulated cortisol doesn't necessarily only mean high cortisol. It could mean flatlined cortisol. It could mean that you've been living under low grade or even high grade chronic stress for so long that your cortisol secretions are no longer appropriate. Your body no longer has the capacity to actually produce and release. And so taking something that is supposed to effectively reduce your cortisol is not necessarily a good thing, much like what you dealt with when you were dealing, when we were working towards resolving an assumed estrogen issue, right? You drove it down even lower, effectively feeling even worse. And so another product that I'm seeing a lot of, and a lot of coaches are talking about, it's in a lot of our sort of hormonal support supplements that a lot of athletes are taking, is the phosphatidylserine. It can be used, especially if you're having really poor sleep, which is driving that cortisol awakening response up really, really high. It is absolutely something that, we have used with clients for a period of about 30 days just to give us the time and space to start resolving a lot of those other hidden stressors. But to take it long term, as many of our athletes do, can be even more so dysregulating to your diurnal rhythm. So are there any other products that you're seeing, supplements that are being promoted, or strategies that are being promoted that you think, again, are lacking context when it comes to cortisol and hormones?
Well, so I actually had this conversation with one of my friends the other day. And so she was telling me, she was like, I think my cortisol is so high because I've been stressed for 5 years. My stress has been extremely high for 5 years. And so she was like, do you have any supplements that you would recommend to take for high cortisol? And so I explained to her, I was like, one thing we really need to realize is you will have high cortisol for only so much time. And at some point, your adrenal glands cannot continue to keep up with the stress. And so they're not going to be able to pump out as much cortisol as stressed as your body is. And so when you're chronically stressed for, let's say, a period of time like 5 years, like this particular friend of mine was, I explained to her, your cortisol is actually going to be very low. And so I think it's honestly just the overall message of really knowing where your cortisol is at before you take any supplement, you do any strategy, because for me personally, I honestly will not recommend any cortisol supplements until I know where somebody is at. Because if you don't know, again, it's just going to probably make it worse. You don't know if it's high, you don't know if it's low, and that's going to drive the problem, honestly, just into overdrive. So I think it's just, like I said, the overall issue of just not knowing where it's at. I think that's where everybody needs to start.
That is absolutely where everybody needs to start. There is a significant difference as far as markers and ranges when we're looking at, an adaptive cortisol response versus a maladaptive cortisol response, but the symptoms can often feel the same because they implicate so many other systems in the body. So you're absolutely right. Run your labs, figure out what's going on. This is why everybody in the functional health space says test, don't guess, right? It's kind of like, guessing at how much cardio you should do or, what your macronutrient intake should be. We want you to actually look at the data. How are you responding to your program? Adjust accordingly. So the same is true when it comes to supplementation and just general stress management. And as Angelica mentioned, we're talking about hormones, your immune system, digestion, detoxification, energy production, the nervous system, and even oxidative stress. So we actually are going to be releasing a stress and hormone workshop. So this is really a masterclass on all things stress and hormones, specifically for our female athletes. We will be releasing it shortly and we will be taking names in the coming week, right? So I think if you're listening to this podcast, then the sign up should be up and open on our socials. I urge you guys to dive in and get to know your hormones. I will say that it seems to me across the board that women in general are just not educated on even their sex hormones, how their reproductive cycle works. When I talk to clients about progesterone and estrogen and the function of all of those hormones and the necessity for testosterone, and I'm not talking about, testosterone in sort of super physiological levels, the way that some athletes do use testosterone. I just mean testosterone and its function in the female body, kind of clueless. And it's not really anybody's fault. It's just not something that we're taught. So we're going to be starting from the ground up and helping you get to know your body better, learning how to actually optimize your hormones and your stress response so that you can function really well in your prep, but also off stage. Because let's be real, we do have lives outside of competition, and our hormones really are those messengers, those chemical messengers that drive all the other processes in our body. And so having them in check is absolutely foundational to good health. So keep an eye out for that. Is there anything else you want to add about our beloved SHP?
Um, I don't believe so. I think that was kind of it.
Okay. So again, as always, if anybody has any questions, if you want to just chat about what it is that you are going through, if you are just really excited about the oncoming competition season and you want to get yourself in the best possible position to get the most out of your program and perform really, really well on stage, then all you need to do is reach out to us. You can send us an email through our website. You can hit us up on Instagram. We'd be happy to just answer your question. And of course, clarity calls are always complimentary. So let's chat. We are going to be talking to an athlete really soon. We'll be talking to our sponsored athlete really soon in an upcoming podcast. So looking forward to that. Brittany Schulman is our sponsored athlete. She is an IFBB bikini pro, and she is actually just in the midst of running her labs. She is absolutely running the SHP and the GI-MAP and the HTMA. So we're going to get a lot of information from her next time we all meet. Be really cool, I think, for everybody to hear what her journey has been like, why she decided to lock arms with us, and what the process of taking these crazy labs in the comfort of your own home looks like. So definitely watch out for that. Tune in for that. And I guess that is it for today. So we'll see y'all next time.
Yeah, see you all next time.
Yeah, bye.